Welcome back to Power Play. What happens to oil and gas workers in a new, greener economy? The federal government's answer, what it calls the Sustainable Jobs Plan, was tabled in the House of Commons today. The feds insist there could be as many as 400,000 new jobs in a clean energy economy by the end of this decade. But the promise of a green economy has put Alberta on the defense. Premier Danielle Smith calling the government's first draft of its plan in February an existential threat to the economy. She responded to today's, legislation by saying, in part, "I remind the federal government that due to emissions reduction technologies, oil and gas sector jobs are also sustainable jobs and will continue to be so for many decades and beyond. This must be clearly recognized by the government and its new advisory panel members. Alberta," she goes on to say, "will not recognize, cooperate with, or enforce any attempt to phase out our province's oil and gas industry or its workforce. This is non-negotiable." Jonathan Wilkinson is the Federal Natural Resources Minister. Hi, Minister Wilkinson. Good pleasure to welcome you to studio. Thank you for making the time.
Not at all. Thank you.
The legislation that you introduced today stipulates that the first actual plan a government would kind of present on how this transition will occur, the details of it, could come as late as December of 2025. Given the severity with which climate change is affecting us, is that soon enough?
Well, I mean, I think I should start by saying we actually did release an interim plan in February, and the formalization of that will be by 2025. But certainly we're taking action on climate change, irrespective of the legislation that we introduced today. I mean, we've committed almost $200 billion. We have a price on pollution. We have a number of regulations we've put into place. Canada has a pretty robust climate plan. I was the environment minister when we developed most of that climate plan. But the other side of the coin, which is what I work on and what this legislation is framed around, is about how do you build an economy that's going to be strong and prosperous, create good jobs and economic opportunity for Canadians who live in every province and territory in this country.
I think that's actually what I meant by the framing of the question. So because of the speed with which climate change is affecting us and the severity, it's making that transition perhaps forced on us at a faster rate than we might have even anticipated. And therefore, doesn't that necessitate more specifics beyond what your interim plan in February produced sooner than the end of 2025, which, by the way, is after the next election?
Yeah, and look, I mean, the action plan is essentially a collection of a lot of the work that's being done by a number of different departments within the government. So we're not waiting for the plan. I mean, in the budget of this year, there were $86 billion in commitments around a clean industrial strategy for Canada. That's relating to climate change. That's about hydrogen, critical minerals, a clean grid. So the work is being done, but the formalization of that in an overall action plan will be done by 2025 with the opportunity for input from provinces and territories, labor unions, industry, Indigenous Canadians, and civil society.
I was trying to think if I were a worker in one of these sectors, like the oil and gas sector, and I was reading through this plan or looking at the investments that you have already made in the economy of the future or plan to make through the money that you just talked about. What does that mean for my prospects for a job? And specifically in, for example, what you've announced so far with Volkswagen or maybe to come with Stellantis, a formalization of that with Stellantis. I have not been able to get an answer, a straight answer from the government about whether we did something the U.S. did, and that is tie explicitly union jobs, good-paying jobs, to the government's investment in those types of plant. Has your government done that?
Well, I mean, all of the tax credits actually, and the tax credits are really the bulk of the new spending, are actually tied to the requirement to pay a prevailing wage. You only get the total value of the credit if you pay the prevailing wage. So
what does prevailing wage mean in layman's terms?
So it is basically the regional wage. It's not just a national wage across the country, and it is related to union wages. And so essentially what we're saying is you actually have to be a company that creates good jobs, not just jobs at the minimum wage, but good jobs if you're going to access government resources to help you actually make that. But look, we are seeing progress on this across the country. I was in Newfoundland a couple of weeks ago announcing almost $100 million for Brea Fuels, which is converting an oil refinery into a biodiesel refinery. I was with the Premier of Newfoundland talking about how we are actually going to create an enormous offshore wind industry that will also create a hydrogen industry to actually sell hydrogen to Germany and to others. There are things happening across the country. In Alberta, the Air Products hydrogen plant, the cement plant with CCUS that Heidelberg just announced, and all of the work with Pathways around actually ensuring that our conventional resources are relevant in a low-carbon world, i.e. reducing production emissions so that we can offer the world low-carbon oil and gas.
I guess what I'm wondering, though, in layman's terms, again, is if I'm sitting right now as an employee of that sector in Alberta, is your government telling me I could still have a job in 30 years if the industry does enough with carbon capture? Or am I going to have to move to Newfoundland or Ontario and get a job at Volkswagen in order to be able to ensure I can still feed my family and take care of them to the degree I am right now?
So it is the responsibility of the federal government to care about the economic prospects of every province and territory in this country. We are working very much with each province and territory to look at the opportunities that exist, including those in conventional energy, to ensure that people actually have access to good jobs in the place that they reside, that they may wish to stay in. In the context, like the Brea Fuels refinery in Newfoundland, that's about maintaining jobs that were in an oil refinery, in now a biodiesel refinery. Carbon capture will sustain jobs in the oil sands and in conventional energy. And look, we will see a reduction in the amount of oil that we use. It will peak in the next 5 to 10 years, and it will start to decline as more zero-emission technologies for transportation, it's mainly a transportation fuel, start to be deployed. But even and through that transition, there will be a need for oil and gas. And even in a 2050 net zero world, you're still going to need at least a quarter of the amount of oil and half the amount of gas in non-combustion applications. So it is relevant in the context of the kinds of jobs. But look, a hydrogen plant, the skill sets are the same as they are in an oil sands or an oil refinery. The same thing is true with a biodiesel plant. There are enormous opportunities in Alberta, in Nova Scotia, in Ontario. The trick is to actually have a plan to seize it. And that has to start with actually believing that climate change is real.
What are you inferring there?
I'm inferring there that we have a leader of the opposition in this country that I don't know whether he just doesn't believe in the science of climate change or he just doesn't think it's very important. But if you look at him relative to his counterparts in Germany, in Japan, in France, almost every other G7 jurisdiction, the Conservatives have a real serious climate plan.
What impact does that have? You're right, they deserve a lot of questions on that, but what impact does that have on your government's ability to ensure that people who will no longer be able to be employed by that sector still have a job by 2050?
Well, look, we have an obligation to ensure that we are working collaboratively with provinces and territories to create jobs and to ensure that where people may have to transition, that we are providing the appropriate supports. That's true of communities as well. I would just say people shouldn't overestimate the amount of displacement that's going to happen through this transition. We will still need oil and gas, but we will also need all of these other things that Canada is blessed to have. I do not honestly worry that we are not going to have enough good jobs. I worry we're not going to have enough people to fill them.
But I'm glad that you're being so forthright because I think that, and from my time in Alberta and even recently, the impression people have there is that your government believes there will be a hard stop through the emissions cap that it plans to introduce or through its sort of understanding of what climate change means. There will be a hard stop to the oil and gas sector. What you're saying today is you don't actually believe that there will be.
Well, no, there won't be. And I've said this explicitly across the country. And if that's the impression that people in Alberta have, then I would certainly like to dissuade them from that view. I grew up in Saskatchewan. I'm a prairie person, and I understand the anxiety that people have in looking towards a future that necessarily, scientifically, must be a lower carbon future. But there are huge opportunities, including in conventional energy. I mean, people should just look at what the IEA says, the International Energy Agency. We will still need significant quantities of these fuels. We will not combust them because that is what causes climate change. But if you want lubricants, waxes, solvents, carbon graphite, a whole range of materials, you need hydrocarbons. But what that says is, if you're going to be continuing to use hydrocarbons in all of these different applications that are non-combustion, you have to worry about production emissions. You have to drive those down to virtually zero.
Do you believe, though, that there is the willingness on the part of those provinces that are home to those resources and the industry to actually invest the money necessary to use technology to the degree that is necessary to do what it has to do with emissions? Because your predecessor, for example, in the environment portfolio, Catherine McKenna, sort of calls, if I could say, BS on this idea that big companies are all of a sudden asking for more money to invest in carbon capture and all of a sudden going to use carbon capture on this massive scale in order to reach net zero. Do you believe that they can and they will?
Carbon capture is one tool. There are a whole range of tools that we need to utilize in terms of making the emissions reductions that are required to follow the science and to achieve net zero. I do believe that the oil and gas industry is working in good faith, particularly the large companies have been very much committed. The Pathways group has been working very actively on this. I do believe they are committed to making the emissions reductions and making the investments, but they want to partner. They want to partner in the Government of Canada. They want to partner in the Government of Alberta. And that is essentially what I'm going out to talk to Premier Smith about next week.
One quick question before I let you go on Premier Smith, because she released a statement in response to this. And she says essentially that there's part of this legislation is the creation of a council that will help inform what the plan looks like. She is demanding, I guess is the fair word to say, that there be representation from Alberta on that council. Will there be?
So we haven't sorted out the precise composition, but certainly regional considerations will play into it. I just formed an electricity grid council, and we actually sought the input of people in the Alberta government before we actually made the appointment. So we will certainly be listening to Premier Smith. I would say that the focus of this legislation is primarily federal jurisdiction, but we want to ensure that regional voices are represented, and I will certainly be talking to her and her energy minister about that.
Does that mean that there will be representation from Alberta?
Well, I can't see a universe in which there would not be Alberta representation. Yes.
Okay, Minister, I'll leave it there. I'm out of time. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it as always.
All right, thank you.